Welcome! On farms all over western New York in February and March, a unique treat is being produced from Mother Nature, maple syrup. Today I'll take us through the process of how maple syrup is produced. Legend has it that the production of maple syrup was discovered by the Algonquin Indians. One day, Waxus, a mighty hunter, was out hunting in the season of melting snow. His squaw Moqua was preparing dinner for his return. On her way to the spring for water, she noticed a large cavity in a huge sugar maple tree. It had water in it that was dripping from a broken branch. She decided to take the water and cook the venison to save a trip to the spring. She put the venison in a pot, in the water, and was busy cooking, and she didn't come back to check on it. The sweet water boiled away to leave the venison coated with a thick, brown syrup. When Waxus returned, he found such a dainty morsel for supper that he had never tasted before. The great chief eagerly devoured the meat and licked the kettle clean. Maple syrup is a delicious treat for sure. But how exactly is it made? Is it as simple as boiling some sap to make syrup? Well, yes and no. In order to make great maple syrup, it takes a lot of planning, a system to collect the sap, a way to boil the sap, and a finishing process to get it to our tables. Now, the beginning of the process to produce this delicious maple syrup is planning. Long before the snow melts, the maple producer must have a plan to collect the sap to make maple syrup. The stage includes the hardware preparation and mapping out a tapping plan. The hardware needed for tapping is a battery-powered drill with a 7/16" drill bit, some good boots, and a lot of muscle. The tapper must be prepared for changing weather conditions and have plenty of battery power for the drill. The collection hardware consists of tapping spouts, like this one, and either tubing or a bucket for collection. Teflon tubing is used to channel the sap from the tree to larger collection tanks, and for smaller operations, the sap is collected in buckets like this one and then emptied into larger tanks later. Now, before the tapper can step foot in the woods, the tapper must have a tapping plan. The tapper usually map out a section of woods that will be tapped and plan to systematically work uphill and downhill until all of the trees are tapped. Typically, we plan for about 1 to 4 taps to be placed into each tree depending on the size. The tapper has to know what trees to tap, what trees to avoid due to their small size, and how many taps to put into each tree. Now, tapping trees is fairly easy, but it can be strenuous. Each hole is drilled about 3 inches deep, and the spout is placed into the hole. A light tap with a hammer secures the spout into this tree without splitting it, and the sap begins to flow. Each spout is either connected to some preset tubing or a collection bucket. Working around the tree, 2 to 3 taps are placed into each tree and put at different heights, each with a spout, and each either connected to tubing or installed with a bucket. The tapper then can move on to the next tree until all the trees are tapped in that section of the sugar bush. After all the taps and tubing are in place and the temperatures reach the perfect combination of freezing nights and warmer days, the sap begins to flow. The next step in this process is storage of the sap. Remote sections of the woods require remote tanks that are then emptied and transported to the sugar shack, where the syrup is actually made. At the sugar shack, a large tank and some intermediate tanks are used to store the sap until it's ready for the concentration process. At this point in the process, the sap is a watery, clear liquid that is about 99% water and 1% sugar. It has the properties of water, it tastes like water, and as you can see with this one, I took this from last week's run, so I'll pass this around later and you can take a look at it. After the sap is collected and all in storage, it's ready for the concentration stage, where the syrup begins to take shape. Now, the stages in the process of sap concentration include initial concentration and boiling. Historically, the sap would just be placed into a large flat pan and a wood fire would be built underneath to boil the sap until it reaches the right sugar content. Nowadays, several automated systems, such as reverse osmosis, help the maple producer cut fuel costs, speed the concentration process, and get to the finished product sooner. The main goal during the initial concentration stage is to reduce the amount of water in the concentrate so that boiling time is reduced. This saves fuel in the process of making maple syrup. It takes 4 gallons of fuel oil to boil sap for 1 gallon of syrup. So you can see why increasing the efficiency of the process would help cost effectiveness of the production. Now, once some of the water is removed, the concentrate is then ready to be pumped to the boiling pans to remove the final amounts of water and produce syrup. However, maple producers found that if they preheat the concentrate prior to boiling, then they can reduce the time and the fuel it takes by 40%. So the concentrate is sent through a series of heat exchangers and preheated to the boiling point using the steam from the sap that's boiling below it. The longest and most delicate part of the maple syrup production process is the final evaporation stage. It's during this stage that the water content, density, and temperature must be strictly monitored to ensure that the concentrate doesn't overboil or scald. Now, since the boiling point of the syrup is higher than the boiling point of the water, maple producers use the density to indicate when the concentrate is reaching the consistency of maple syrup. When the density is reached, the hot syrup is drawn off from the downstream side of the evaporator and it's put into a temporary storage tank. Then it's ready for the finishing process. The first stage in the finishing process is filtering. Filtering is needed because during the boiling process, impurities like lime are precipitated out of the sap and need to be removed. Once filtered, the syrup is pumped to a 30-gallon storage tanks where it's temporarily stored until it's either bottled or used for other maple products. In order to get the maple syrup to the consumer's table, it must be packaged for individual use. Maple syrup is most often placed in sealable containers as small as a small sample jar or as large as 1-gallon jugs, or placed in cans like the one I have here. Then it's ready to deliver to your table. When the Algonquin Indians first discovered that sap from the sugar maple tree could be boiled to make maple syrup, that must have been an exciting discovery. And although the process for producing maple syrup was simple, boil the sap, it's the same process we use today. We have come a long way to commercialize and maximize the process to produce high quality, consistent, and repeatable results for the consumer. Yet in the end, it takes some sap from the sugar maple tree and a way to boil it to make syrup. This spring, take a drive into the country and discover the beauty of God's creation. To find a sugar shack along some back road. You'll be able to find it when you see the white plume of steam rising from the roof of the shack and you can smell that sweet aroma in the air. When you find some, sit back and enjoy, knowing that much work went into the production of that syrup, but it's worth every drop. Thank you.